had southern roots, as I mentioned. He has this plantation of about 850 acres and about 30 slaves at the height of his wealth and prosperity. He also has a title, colonel, which I've mentioned. It was an honorary title. He had no military background, but an indication of his wealth and stature in the community of St. Louis. Now, some of you know how Ulysses Grant arrived here. Graduated from West Point, assigned to Jefferson Barracks, a military post about 5 miles from here. His senior year at West Point, Julia's older brother was his roommate. Julia's older brother grew up here. Well, he doesn't get that assignment only 5 miles from home. Jefferson Barracks is along the Mississippi River, 5 miles from him. But he tells his roommate to go out and visit his family, and they'll get him acclimated to the area. Well, of course, this is how he discovers Julia. Now, obviously, they're going to be married. They're a military family. They're going to move around the country. They're a military family, which means there's been a separation. And it happens frequently with military families. Their separation lasted for 2 years. Now, by the way, when he resigned from the Army to come back and be with Julia in the year 1854, he was stationed on the West Coast at Fort Humboldt, which I understand is not too far from San Francisco. Now, when he returns in that year 1854, welcome family. When Ulysses Grant returns here in that year 1854, that is 10 years after he met Julia, 6 years after they were married, and after a 2-year separation. For the next 6 years, about exactly 6 years, 1854 to 1860, Ulysses and Julia will be living in St. Louis, and about half of that time in this home. Now that is going to influence the rest of his life. He will return here to live under the roof of his father-in-law, and some of you didn't hear me. His father-in-law was the height of Southern aristocracy as it was known in Missouri. Ulysses, on the other hand, is born and raised in Ohio, a free state. His parents were abolitionists and they hated slavery. They hated it so much that when they discovered his family was moving into, when they discovered that Ulysses was moving into this family, marrying into this family, they chose not to come to his wedding. That's a rather emphatic statement, wouldn't you think? Well, they disapproved. Now, you can be sure that Ulysses, as a young man, has heard a lot about slavery. But he's not going to see much of it in Ohio. He's not going to see any of it in Ohio. He did spend a year in school in Kentucky where he may have seen slavery on an infrequent basis, but he really doesn't begin to see slavery on a day in and day out basis until he returns here in that year 1854. Military career, he's not going to see much slavery. It takes him into parts of the country where it's not permitted. Well, when he returns here in 1854, not only does he begin to see slavery on a day in and day out basis, but he actually argues with Colonel Dent about this. That would be Julia's father and his father-in-law. That's arguing politics over the dinner table, if no one caught that. And some of us may have experience with that. And what does this arguing and constant challenging he receives from his father-in-law do for him? Well, it enables Ulysses to begin to strengthen and sharpen his attention to the two founding principles of the country, freedom and democracy. Now, also the root causes of the Civil War. The Civil War began to preserve a democracy, and it transcended into granting freedom to everyone in the country. Now, this constant challenging that Ulysses receives from his father-in-law enables him to begin to take ownership of these principles, freedom and democracy. And by the way, Colonel Dent would refer to those as slavery and secession, both of which he's very comfortable with. By the time Ulysses leaves here in 1860 to go to Galena, Illinois, and the video will touch on some of the reasons why he left, but 1 year before the war begins, Ulysses and Julia pack up their family and they move to Galena, Illinois to work with his brothers in the family's leather goods store. Well, when he leaves, of course, he packs up the children and Julia and all their possessions, and up to Galena he goes. And he took something else with him. He took these newly reinforced values of freedom and democracy, these things that are hard to understand when you're a youth, easier to understand when you're an adult, and much more so, when you actually see what it's all about. Well, he's taken ownership of them, if you will, and he carries them with him to Galena, and he uses them not only in Galena, but for the rest of his life. Many of the things that Ulysses Grant did as the famous general, and again as President of the United States, can be traced to the experience he had living here. And it's really no stretch to say that Ulysses Grant is one of those Americans who's truly shaped the course of our nation's history.